We are diving into the topic of emotional intelligence, what it is, what it isn't, how to develop it, mistakes leaders make around EQ. And to do it, I am with level 52 executive coach and facilitator, Liz Doyle Harmer. Liz, welcome to the Executive Commute.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here with you.
I'm excited to have you in the discussion, sharing your expertise, which is exactly the place that I'm going to start. Because before we get into the deep discussions around EQ, here's possibly the hardest question. What is it that makes you qualified to speak about emotional intelligence?
I love that question. So, emotional intelligence is something I've dedicated myself to learning about, not because it's something that comes easily to me, but because I've struggled with it personally. I think, many of us in our culture, we were raised to bottle it up or distract ourselves from emotions. And what I learned the hard way is that's not necessarily the best way to actually navigate or lead yourself through life. So I've come to learn about emotional intelligence largely because of my own inadequacy in doing that naturally. And then in professional contexts, I'm certified in EQI 2.0, an emotional intelligence assessment tool. I work with leaders in improving their emotional intelligence as well. And it's something I think about too with my four kids and how, how I might improve that skill in them as well.
Yes, so that is one thing we have in common. Aside from our work with leaders, we both have four kids,
Not too many
which
people have that.
yeah, that's right. And which means even more opportunities to test our emotional intelligence,
Absolutely.
as raising kids can be a challenge, like having a business and many of the curveballs life throws at us. But you said your own inadequacy around EQ. What has that looked like?
Yeah. So I think going back to when I was younger, and I think it's helpful for actually everybody listening to this podcast here to go back and think about what were the messages I was told about emotions and how I should handle my emotions. And in some families, it's just bottle it up, don't pay too attention to it, distract yourself. In my family, when I was having emotional challenges, and I went to my dad at the time and asked for advice, he said, "Well, you got to let it out. You got to let it out." So that's what I did. That's not always a helpful way. It's actually not normally a helpful way to manage emotions. I let it out. There's a lot of letting out emotions in the family that I grew up in, and then I carried that through to my own family. Particularly with the first two. By the time I got around to the second two, I had learned a few things, but letting out my emotions in ways that weren't always helpful is something that I've personally struggled with.
Like letting out the anger, just releasing the anger, the
Yeah,
frustration.
yeah. Yeah, that's it. In ways that were harmful and hurtful to people and harmful and hurtful to the relationship as well. I think after that, recognizing that letting it out wasn't always the best way to deal with things, I then went into a stage where I kind of bottled it up. And I think that's the other thing that leaders can do, that humans can do, where we're not letting it out, but we're just kind of like pretending it's not there. And I actually think sometimes that's one thing I stumble upon with leaders. They think they're emotionally intelligent because they aren't letting it out, because they're not throwing computers or yelling at their team. They think they're emotionally intelligent, but actually what I see very often is they're kind of bottling up or repressing or pushing aside emotions.
Okay, so we have letting it out as one strategy. We have bottling it up or suppressing emotions as another strategy. Before we get too far down the line, let's lock in a definition or a shared understanding. When you say EQ or emotional intelligence, what are we talking about?
So it's such a good question. And as I was reviewing to prepare for this podcast, I was reminded that even in psychological research, when they're researching emotions, the term they use to define emotions actually changes depending on the researcher. So it's not like there's one answer that defines it all. But one way I come to see emotions is that it's physiological sensations that happen in the body. And then we put a label to them, like anger or frustration or sadness or joy or gratitude, but it's this combination of physiological sensations with the label that we give it.
So I'm also in preparing for this discussion. Like I was pursuing a definition of EQ. And here's what I want to throw at you because I like this definition that EQ is one's capacity to perceive, interpret, and utilize emotional information for adaptive decision making and relational navigation.
I love
I know
that.
it's a mouthful.
No, I love it. And I actually, when I reflect back on what I gave you a definition of emotions and not the
Mhm.
intelligence part. And that's exactly what you did. And I would be in 100% in agreement with you. The reason we do that, the reason why we want to be able to work with our emotions is so that we can increase our capacity to lead ourselves and also lead others.
Yeah, that relational navigation. It's one thing to just let out your emotions, the anger, the frustration. But if I'm in an organization, we
Yeah.
have to succeed together.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so much of what we're asking of leaders to do today, in addition to mastering AI, which everybody needs to do. If I look at Harvard or Deloitte and look at their recent studies on what leaders need to focus on, in addition to learning AI, it is the human side of it. And a big part is emotional intelligence. Increasing your skill in emotional intelligence is a key part of leadership. And I would say even, and it's not just me saying it, Harvard saying it, Deloitte saying it too, especially when we have the computers being able to handle the technical side, we need to lean into the human side.
Okay, well let's drill into that. I don't want to make any assumptions, but what is important about a leader possessing strong EQ?
I think there's quite a few applications here. So we can look at it in terms of self leadership and then other or relational leadership. So if we start with self leadership, one of the things that's important about improving emotional intelligence is so that you can have access to more information. So a lot of times we lean into cognitive thinking, which is great. That's one way to get information, but our emotions also have information for us. It's more data. And the more data we have, the better informed we are and the better able we can make decisions. So I can give you an example of this. There's a leader I was working with, and she came into a session, and I often do a check-in, like many of us coaches do at the beginning of the session, how are you coming in? She's like, I'm overwhelmed. Okay, let's get curious. Let's get curious about that. What's going on? And so one of the things that I think is involved in improving emotional intelligence is being with the physical sensations that come with our emotions. And so when we actually drill down and paid attention to what are the sensations that are happening for you now, right? There was a contraction. She felt like an uprising of energy. She saw like red. We recognize she's actually not overwhelmed. She's angry. She's angry. And she was angry because someone in a meeting earlier that morning had not done something they said they were going to do. And so by taking that moment to check in and really get more information about what's happening on the emotional level. So she went from I'm overwhelmed to I'm angry. That can lead to two very different responses. I'm overwhelmed can lead to I'm going to take a break. I'm angry can lead to, well, in her case, it was, I need to have a conversation with this person about this. Her anger was not irrational. It was there for a reason. There was something that had to be addressed. And so by really paying attention to it, that leads to two very different responses. And sometimes having the conversation is actually the response you need to take, which improves your performance as a leader.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is when you pause and you fully understand what's happening in this physiological cluster of emotions,
Yeah.
that then when you get it right, then it's accuracy.
Yeah, it can lead to more accuracy, more information, better decision making. And I think I love that you've asked that because sometimes we might get it wrong. So paying attention to physiological sensations. So I'll go back to this leader. This was not the case for her, but sometimes we can pay attention to physiological sensations. We notice there's this experience or this emotion of anger, and we're always making sense of things based on our previous experiences. So that's a lot of where our sense making comes. It's based on our previous experiences. So sometimes for some leaders, they might check in, they might notice there's sensations there. They might say, oh, I'm angry. But this anger might be an older story. Like nobody ever stands up for me. Nobody ever does anything for me. And so we want to make sense of what are the sensations saying. And then we also want to take a moment to question them. Is this accurate? Is this accurate? Just because it's there doesn't mean that it's true. Just like we can have faulty math skills, we can have faulty cognitive intelligence, we can make a mistake in our math. We can also make a mistake in how we're interpreting the physiological sensations that are happening in our body. And so it's really just a matter of, yes, notice the sensations, get curious about what the sensations are saying, and then get curious whether that's actually accurate or not.
It reminds me of a practice that I still lean into that my coach introduced to me several years ago, that it was a series of questions where in journaling or starting my day, asking myself, what am I feeling? What has me feeling that way? Like, why am I feeling that way? What is this feeling telling me about myself? And then based on that, what's the action that needs to happen? Is that an EQ practice?
I would say it is. Yeah, I would say it is. And I really like that the action piece is there in that framework because leadership is about taking action, but it's about taking the right action too. And what you said, what am I feeling? Why might I be feeling that way? I think that's such a helpful question because sometimes we can make mistakes there. Sometimes we're feeling a bunch of feelings and it's really just because we're tired. We haven't slept well, you know, and sometimes it's because no, there's something that somebody did that I need to address, or I'm feeling a certain way about something else and I need to figure that out. But it's always helpful to pause and get curious about why you're feeling that.
So let's go to this situation of the leader, that it's not overwhelm, it's anger. I've
Mm.
diagnosed it, and let's say it's accurate. I am angry. How do I make sure that then I go into a discussion with Liz now that I know that I'm angry and I need to have this discussion, but how do I do so in a space of actualizing that emotional intelligence and not just being like, okay, Liz, buckle up.
Yeah, I love that. Right? We don't want to go into what I used to do, which is the let it out mode, right? Generally, that's not going to get you promoted. And so there's a framework I like to use, and we've kind of started to piece it out here. Um, called Ark. So I grew up very Catholic. When Noah was flooded, he built an ark. And it's the same thing. When we're emotionally flooded or overwhelmed, we can build an ark. So the A is for awareness. And we've discussed a little bit about what the awareness is. What are the physiological sensations? You know, if those sensations could speak, what would they say to you? And then is that actually accurate, right? Going through that process. That's all part of awareness. Then the R, it goes to where you're going. I call it re-anchoring, right? We don't want to anchor in anger as we go and have that conversation. We want to anchor in something else. What might that be? Calm, curiosity, even gratitude, right? Even gratitude, even in a situation. So for one of my four children, like you have yours, they did not pick up their socks again for the 99th time. I can still anchor in gratitude that I've got this child, that they're here in this house with me, that they're healthy, you know, that I'm healthy, that I can have this conversation before I go and address the sock that needs to be picked up. I can still anchor in that. And this leader could do that too before she goes. It's unlikely that it's a black and white situation and that this person who did something wrong is always wronging her, right? There's likely something that can be appreciated about that person. Find that and then go have the conversation. So the R is about re-anchoring in something that's more helpful.
Okay. Eh, I'm now I'm curious about what the K is in the arc, but re-anchoring, here's the thought that goes through my mind.
Yeah.
Okay, it sounds great to re-anchor in gratitude.
Yeah.
But if this is a repetitive performance issue and I am generally at my wit's end,
Yeah. Yeah.
it can be really hard to re-anchor in something that would be more attributed to a positive emotion.
Yeah. I'd say you're right. If it's, especially if it's a conversation that you've had before, if you've never had the conversation, then maybe there's more possibility there to anchor in something that's more helpful. If it's something that is happening again and again, even after you've addressed it, then maybe you need to anchor in something else, which is a firm boundary or decisiveness or something else. It could be something else that you need to anchor in as well.
Yeah, the thought comes to mind is maybe it's anchoring in the courage for me to have the type of clear conversation that I haven't had before.
I love that. Courage. Yeah, anchor in courage. That's a great thing to anchor in. Absolutely. Yeah, maybe before it was a waffly way you were addressing it.
Okay, the K in ARC. Awareness, we have re-anchor. What's the K?
So this it's actually C and I'm calling and
C.
it's
Okay.
choice. Yeah, choice. So that's the action. What is it? So anger, frustration, you can re-anchor in calm or curiosity or courage or gratitude. C is have the conversation. C is the action. Have the conversation. Maybe it's having a more firm conversation. Maybe that's the C. And notice that it's a very different C that comes from recognizing you have anger than recognizing you are overwhelmed, where the C might be take a break
Yeah.
or take a
Yeah.
nap.
I'm going to choose to defer the conversation until I really feel that I'm in a place to have it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great choice to make.
What gets mistaken for EQ in leadership?
I think there's quite a few things that get mistaken. So one is that emotions have no place in the workforce. I still see that people just don't want to deal with them. And I think when you do that, you're actually, anytime I hear that, I'm actually at the point where I think you're not actually acting at your peak potential if you're not paying attention to emotions. It's part of our human reality. And so if you're not finding a way to work skillfully with emotions, and I'm not saying that my way is the only way. There's lots of different frameworks and approaches. But if you're not in some way finding a way to work skillfully with emotions, you're actually limiting your peak potential. And so I'll give you I'll give you two actually concrete examples around this. So one is when we're not managing our emotions well, it's not like they just disappear. They're stored in our body. It doesn't feel good to have them in our body. And so we distract ourselves. We grab the cookie when we're not hungry. We doom scroll on our phones when actually there's more productive work that we could be doing. So that's one way where not working through your emotions actually limits your performance because you're leaning into activities that are at best time wasting and at worst cause additional harm for yourself. Like I've gone on to doom scrolling where you at the end you actually feel worse after. So that's one reason I would say that neglecting our emotions or saying this is not important, that's one way that it actually limits your peak potential. The other thing I would say is when you're leading teams, being skillful with emotions is really important if you're going to lead a team. So trust, empathy, all the things we want leaders to have right now, those are emotional words, trust and empathy. But I also think things like inspiring your team. So as a culture, we pay a lot of money to people who can make us feel emotionally different. Athletes, artists, musicians, we pay them a lot of money, mostly because when we watch them, we feel different when we watch them. That's why we pay them what we pay them. And so if you're a leader that can emotionally influence others in hopefully helpful and productive ways, my wager is that your income will go up. You will make more money. You will elevate yourself in your career if more people follow you and you're able to influence them in an emotional way.
Fascinating. Up on what you said around skillfully using emotion. What does that mean? What does it look like?
Yeah. So I think there's a few applications to it. I think one is that self emotional piece, right? Going through ARC, being able to have a process to work through your own emotions, get the information from them, and use that information to inform decision making. I would say that's one aspect of it. I think the other is the emotional influence piece. So as a leader, if you are leading teams, you actually influence the emotional tone in a room more than anybody else does. We know from neurons that we all have this ability. If I walk into a room, even if I'm not a leader, if I walk into well, we're all leaders because we all have impact and influence. But if I'm not a quote unquote leader with a certain title, if I'm in a bad mood and I'm a junior employee, and I walk into a room, is everybody else going to feel that in the room? They're going to feel it. They're going to feel it, and so that's important for all of us to be considering. But it's even more important if we're in that quote unquote formal leadership position where more people are looking to us, where we have our emotional tone has more of an impact on what's happening. in the team.
Is there ever a moment where a leader should just let it out, where anger does play a positive role?
Huh. That's a good question. So, I mean, if we're talking about letting it out, like yelling or berating people, I don't think that's helpful. If we're communicating in a way that is still respectful, but communicates our level of frustration around something, I think that's okay. What's coming up for me is the piece around connection. Am I losing connection? Am I creating a breach in the relationship through the way I'm handling this? I,
Where it takes me is there have been times, if I just think about my kids, where I have had a disproportionately angry response to something through whether it's fatigue, a culmination of things that shortly after, when I go back to them and genuinely apologize for my response, that has led to some deep discussion and has been sort of a cohesion agent, for lack of a better term.
yeah,
In if I can understand or explain that, hey, I'm not perfect. I shouldn't have responded that way. And here is the piece that I wish I could have communicated
yeah,
better
mhm,
when I blew up at you.
yeah. So I'm still learning that too. And like you, I apologize and I repair after. I've always done that. That's one thing that I pat myself on the back for. Many times where I, let out my emotions in ways that I wish I could go back and didn't do, but I always went back and repaired and said, I love you and I'm sorry if I made you feel like I didn't. And how can I do better next time at communicating this? So I think, to your point or your question around, is it ever helpful to let it all out? I would say, maybe there are better ways to do it, but if it happens, you can always repair. And what you're demonstrating is you can repair in a way that you make the relationship stronger as well. So it's not that we have to be perfect all the time.
Well, and I think that that's a great question. We often hear if a leader shows up as composed all of the time, that they just get it, then that actually can create a gap. People go, I can never be like that. Versus the value of showing the cost of being human, which is we don't always show up at our best, that make leaders more relatable.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it can. And again, just if we've reacted in a way that might cause some kind of harm or a breach in the relationship, then there should be a step to repair it after. I actually don't think people want to work for robots. I mean, I know that we're coming out.
We'll find out soon.
Out exactly. We will find out. But I don't think we want to work for robots. Like, I think we appreciate people and are more motivated by leaders who have some emotional range to them.
Well, and you talk about the athletes or artists that inspire us. There's something about overcoming obstacles, about the redemption story, the underdog story. That's not all about being perfect.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I think emotional intelligence is more of an art than a science. I'll say that. And I don't think being perfect means being without emotion or showing up and not having your emotions show. But I do think it's being able to use emotions and communicate in a way that one gets your point across and also brings people closer to you. So there is a way that you can be frustrated and angry about something and explain why it matters and why you care about it. And even though you're communicating why you're upset about something, it still brings people closer to you. And I think that's a skill in emotional intelligence is being able to communicate in a way what you're experiencing in a way that keeps the connection there.
What's the relationship between EQ and IQ?
Well, that's a good question. So I don't know. What I do know is that IQ is seen to be more fixed and EQ is not. So EQ, I was definitely very, very low in EQ at one point in my life. I still work to strengthen it. I've made strides. It can be improved. So if you are one of those people who's listening to this and thinking, "Oh, I think my EQ is low," it's not fixed. You can improve it.
There's been that statement we've heard that EQ is more important than
Mm.
IQ. There are some studies that contradict that.
Okay.
What's your take?
So I think going forward, as we're building machines that handle more of the technical stuff and can process things faster than we can, I do think the human side of leadership is going to become more important. And I do think skills like emotional intelligence will become more important for us to really lean into going forward. I think particularly when we look at building trust on teams, um, having compassion as a leader, these are emotional skills that I think are becoming. I don't know if it's possible to get those from a computer. Maybe you can. I don't know. The latest news report I read said that we don't actually trust robots. People don't trust robots. We've seen too many Terminator movies. Uh, but I think my feeling is that EQ will become more important.
There's research that shows that there are highly technical IQ driven roles that have minimal emotional demands. Scientists, mechanics, accountants, that engineers that you don't want a high IQ
Hmm.
because the
Oh,
emotions or
EQ?
impact
People
on
want
other
to.
people can override performance.
Okay. Okay. So some of these skills, they have high IQ
High
requirements.
IQ,
Don't want a high EQ in those.
it can lead to lower performance. But then
Interesting.
yeah, and when we look at how organizations promote then is we promote these high performers
Mhm.
that the best ones then according to these highly technical roles would have lower EQ, but then now you're a manager of people. And I think there is significant research that shows EQ when you're a manager of people now is incredibly important for activating and creating the conditions for success around.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then how do you fix the flaw in the system then?
Yeah.
For especially highly technical roles. Engineer, I don't want you influenced by the emotion. Focus on the calculation, the information required. But then you've had so many reps at that, then we're setting a new manager, a leader up for failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you get around that?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think one of it is just naming exactly what you just named. Like, hey, what got you here is not going to get you there. You've been leaning into your technical skills. That's not going to be what helps you thrive as a leader. You're going to have to exaggerate a little bit, find the human side of yourself in this leadership role. I also just want to say, if they're in those technical roles and they're kind of, carp, they're compartmentalizing in a way, they're leaning more into their IQ and kind of leaving aside EQ. They might be succeeding in the role, but are they really thriving in life? May or may not be. I don't know. It's just a question.
Well, in these cases, it's positioned in a way where an overly emotionally intelligent person might second guess technical decisions or get distracted by some of the interpersonal dynamics when just precision's required.
I see.
And so it's the tension between the IQ driven processes versus the EQ influence, and when do they supplement or support each other and when do they conflict?
I think you're right. I think it's naming it and hopefully naming it before they choose to take the role. If you're going to go into leadership, know this, that you'll need to develop what is often a messier side of intelligence. Cognitive intelligence is kind of easy in a way. You read the book, you follow the steps, there you go. Emotional intelligence is not. It's messier. It is messier. There's complexity to it, and
Well,
it's
yeah, it's interesting because I had a colleague working in San Francisco. He was a software engineer, and he said he was a very average to below average performer. There were better software engineers around him, but the senior leadership noticed that during lunch, people were always around this guy.
hey,
And so they said, okay, well, we're not going to lose a whole lot in the development if we promote you, and we know people love you. So how do you take your average performer that you know people lean into and elevate them versus the classic, the only way I can promote Liz as a technical performer is to elevate her into a managerial role when that may be the worst possible thing for both you and the organization. We can talk about the benefits of EQ, but what's the downside of EQ?
Now, what comes to me now is that it's learning something new, which in the beginning takes time and effort, right? It takes time and effort. And I think the downside is just going through that process of learning something new. I don't see much of a downside. I mean, except for the research you just shared with me, which I hadn't heard before, that having an EQ can actually make you perform less well in technical roles. I haven't seen much of a downside in my experience. It is something that helps us navigate life and leadership more effectively. There's just some time and effort required to do it.
Yeah, well, in my preparation and in service of really getting a fulsome picture, I tried to actively source some downside or contrarian perspectives that I'd love to unpack. And one of them is that individuals can be more susceptible to analysis paralysis and burnout when
Mhm.
it comes to the impact on relationships, where too much emotional awareness and empathy can increase anxiety and lead to leaders maybe not making decisions as quickly as they could.
So too much EQ, so too much time
Yeah.
spent on emotions can lead
Yeah.
to.
Worrying, okay, what's the impact on Liz if I'm overly empathetic to your situation? That it can lead to that paralysis. And in some cases, if a leader carries that burden, too much EQ can cause burnout,
Yeah, yeah,
a lack of effectiveness.
yeah. So it's so interesting because when I think of emotional intelligence, I'm always thinking of it in relation to what is the thing you're striving towards. Because I think to lead ourselves well, we actually need to know what is the vision we're working towards, that thing we care about in the future that we're striving towards. And so, in my view, emotional intelligence is one of the things that helps you stay on the path to moving towards that vision. And so, I'm always framing it in the context of that. And so, if somebody has a lot of empathy, right, which is something that I have as well, and that empathy is getting in their way so that they're not actually making decisions that leads themselves, their team, the organization to the vision they're striving towards, then I would say that's not EQ. That is having too much empathy, but it's not EQ. So EQ for me is about being clear on where we're going and being able to work through the emotions that show up for us in our leadership and in our lives in a skillful way so that we can actually accelerate progress towards
Okay.
what we're driving towards.
Yeah, I love that. So it's EQ isn't, you know what? I don't want to upset Liz's feelings and have this direct conversation. That's not EQ. That's over indexing harmony. But EQ is, okay, I notice I'm uncomfortable thinking about giving Liz direct feedback, working through that discomfort and being able to get in a conversation with you to correct, repair the issue, whatever it is. That's the ultimate expression.
That's absolutely it. I love that. We can get what for someone in that situation who's not having the conversation because they care too much about not hurting somebody's feelings. They are actually gripped by empathy. They are flooded by empathy. They are merged with empathy. And empathy, we don't actually want that. We want to be able to have empathy, but have it at a distance so that we can take the action that's most important.
Yeah, really, you can get flooded in empathy the same way you can get flooded in anger.
100%. That's it. Yeah. One thing I've learned in my journey with emotions is we can get overwhelmed by any emotion, not just the ones we think of as quote unquote, bad or hard emotions. We can get overwhelmed by empathy, compassion, excitement. We can get
Joy.
overwhelmed by those. Yeah. Joy. We can get overwhelmed by those emotions. And what I would say is we're overwhelmed by them if we've lost our ability to move towards what matters. And then I would also say that we can also avoid. being with certain emotions. And we think or we can have a discomfort with some of them. And sometimes we think it's just, oh, it's just the bad ones that we have a discomfort with, like anger or frustration. Obviously, I don't want to be with those, or grief or sadness. But actually, for some people, it's actually hard to be with joy or ease or aliveness. It's actually hard to be with those too. So we can get flooded by all types of emotions, and we can avoid being with all types of emotions too. And those are both signs of poor emotional intelligence.
If you are deeply feeling an emotion, something that we would classically label as a positive or negative, if it becomes an impediment for where you're heading, then that's where the next level of emotional intelligence is required. But you just said something that I relate to, and my wife would attest to, is the accessing joy versus accessing anger have very different access points to me. And I think maybe a lot of performers can relate to this. At least that's what I make up. That the anger or frustration, that is not difficult for me to access, but really sitting with joy without just skipping to the next, what needs to happen is quite elusive.
I know. Yeah. Because you're a peak performer, because you were an athlete. So you're a high achiever. And I think that's the downfall of many of us high achievers. I see this all the time. Somebody who has worked to that next level of success. Once I get here, I will relax. I will feel good. I will have ease. I will have joy. And as soon as you get there, maybe you give yourself half a day, and then you're right away on to the next
If
thing.
that, yeah.
And I actually think being able to, you might be familiar with his work, but Gay Hendricks calls this an upper limit. That's what it is. You have the inability to increase your happiness set point, your joy set point. And I think that's that's also a part of emotional intelligence as well, is being able to be with these expanded emotions that we actually want. Because I think we're actually burning ourselves out by keep putting it off and pushing the ball further out.
So we talked about the downside, or explored the downside to EQ. There's something even further, the dark side of EQ, that I found some interesting research around. There is the case where highly developed EQ can lead to advanced manipulation. If I know how to listen and exude empathy without actually being empathetic, can lead to some very masterful ability to manipulate others.
Yeah. Yeah. So that worries me. Even when I shared, a key part of emotional intelligence is being able to influence the emotional tone in the room. As a leader, you might want to bring in some excitement or aliveness or inspiration. And even as I shared that, there was a little niggle in my head that was like, don't share this with people with evil intentions, because they can be quite masterful at influencing others in, as you said, dark ways. And I think
Yeah.
unfortunately, they're skilled at emotional intelligence, and so we might need a whole other podcast on being a good human.
Well, it is in some of the preparation for this podcast. There, there are similarities between classic Stoic philosophy and emotional intelligence, that there was a discipline and an honor with it. However, the difference between modern EQ and classic Stoicism is whether or not it's tethered to ethics.
Interesting.
Versus, hey, I should develop my EQ because it will help me matriculate through the organization and get a more senior role with more authority. Versus, it is my responsibility to develop the ability to show up in a way that makes me proud, in a way of honor, when the inevitable emotions hit me.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. I haven't heard that, and I like that. I think that's an important element to consider in emotional intelligence and who you want to be, right, on this planet in this lifetime.
If we look at the dark side or the downside, is very strong EQ can have me be able to manipulate or have you not notice if I'm an underperformer, because I know how to have the conversation so that you let go of some of the data points that would maybe reveal my lack of performance.
Yeah. I mean, I'll admit that I was raised very religiously. I don't really go to church now, but I still think a lot about that side of myself. And so my bias is just always in that ethical, trying to be a good person stance. So to be honest, I haven't thought that much about this dark manipulative use of it, or even
But
how to
that
solve
absence
that.
of ethics, right,
Yeah, or
is
even how to solve that problem. But yeah, you're raising a good point.
well, the moral code, we can assume that everyone else embodies the same moral code or ethics.
Well, we can't assume that. We can't assume that.
You talked about EQ being trained. So if I'm a leader and I'm listening to this conversation and I'm thinking, okay, yes, I want to train the type of intentional and ethics based
Yes.
EQ to help me deliver value. Where would I start?
So I think start with your own perspective around emotions in the first place, and notice have you been the type of leader that's just like, we're leaving it out of here, we're not bringing it in, emotions don't belong here. In one organization I worked with, it was like feelings are the F word, don't bring them in. Just notice if that's been your stance, and if not, and if it has been, get curious about that stance. What might be a more helpful stance to take in your day to day? You can start by going back and looking at what were the things I was told about emotions growing up. How have those messages been impacting me? How do I feel about how they've been impacting me? Do I want to write a new story for myself around the role emotions play in leading myself towards the things I want in my life, towards what I want with my team and my organization? And then, start to take the courageous step, and I say it's courageous, of actually being with the experience of emotions in your body. So that's the part that many of us avoid. We have not been taught how to be with the emotions in our bodies. And so we grab the phone. The phone is actually just the perfect invention to help distract us from any discomfort that we're feeling inside, which is a largely emotional discomfort. And so you start to build the capacity to be with the sensations. It's not the word anger that upsets us, it's the sensations of angers that are hard to be with. And other emotions as well, sadness, joy sometimes. So just start to build that as a practice of being with sensations, noticing the sensations, and increasing your ability to be with that discomfort. Because that, and I don't say this lightly, is what will set you free. Because when we can't be with them, we knee jerk reaction, grab some kind of coping strategy, which takes us away from our effectiveness and takes us away from being on this path of striving towards what we care most about.
I was reading about this a while ago and I can't remember the source, but it had a beautiful description of addiction. And it said it not just addictions that we're used to, like drugs, alcohol, but it said consider it this way that an addiction is anything you lean into to prevent yourself from feeling the thing that you need to be feeling. And so I love how you mentioned our tendency to pick up the phone, or a lot of times for me, it's diving into work and working long hours to avoid feeling whatever needs to be felt.
I love that because sometimes our addictions, I love that definition of addiction, anything you do to avoid feeling what you're supposed to be feeling. And sometimes our addictions look productive. It's actually really easy if you're like doing drugs, obviously bad for you. We can tell that that's an addiction that's not helpful. But the overworking, that's not always easy, even over exercising sometimes. I've done that. Everyone celebrates that. They're like,
Yeah.
yes, way
Yeah.
to go. And it's not always helpful. It's not always helpful when we're doing it in excess.
That's the reward where it gets glorified. And the other reward is we get to hide from feeling the thing that we don't want to face, which there's a criticism around some mainstream EQ training where it ultimately isn't effective because it focuses on the pleasant or the easily manageable emotions, when ultimately the theory is that we have to be able to train those threshold emotions, the high stakes situations when we are feeling rage, shame, existential fear, that's the type of EQ training. But how do you train that?
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I've been in some EQ trainings where it's really EQ training above the neck is how I would say it. Like it's really, I mean, it didn't really get to being with the sensations and the feelings that are happening in the body. And I think, so how do we train ourselves to be with anger? Um,
Well, even beyond that. Not how do you train yourself to be with anger? How do you train yourself so you have a feeling of rage, but you can respond responsibly, not aggressive? Or how you can still find a way to be present in a space of shame
Yeah.
where it's hard to just look someone in the eye.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go with your first one, rage. So there's a couple ways I might do this. So just say my pattern is we all have these typical, familiar emotional pathways that we tend to go down, right? And so just say for someone it's over anger, it's anger or it's rage, and they want to change that. So one of the things might do is go back to a previous experience of you having anger or rage and bring that to mind, be in that, and actually visualize yourself choosing a different response. And what I would say, don't even visualize it. Go back and allow yourself to feel those emotions you felt in that moment and figure out a way to move from those rage emotions to something else in your body, whether that's calm, whatever it is. Find a way to shift that your physiology first, and then visualize yourself responding differently.
So would this be part of the arc process, the re-anchoring?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's basically arc, but you're going back and having awareness around what was happening in that moment. You're re-anchoring in something else, and then visualize yourself making a different choice in that moment.
Mm.
And so use those past experiences as a way to train yourself to find a different response in the future. So that's one way.
It's not as effective if you think back to the experience and get yourself to the point where you're feeling
Yeah.
the same
You want to feel it.
intensity.
You want to feel it. You want to feel it. Absolutely. Go back to the moment and feel it. And have some discernment there. I think of this as going to the gym. So you don't have to make it full on. You're way back there. Feel everything. Like that might be 100-pound weight. Just do like a 5-pound weight. Go back. Bring it up. Bring up a little bit of it. Feel it. Feel the emotions. See if you can physiologically shift those, re-anchor in calm, re-anchor in something else, and then visualize yourself making a different choice. And this will just start to open up the capacity for you to choose something else in a future rage moment. I would say if you've been practicing rage for a long time, it's not going to be just one repetition that gets you there. You might have to do it a few times.
What?
Yes.
Just that once isn't going to fix it. Come on.
And then I would also say you can go forward. So at the beginning of your day, just say you're in a fast paced climate of lots of change, uncertainty. I don't know if there's anybody out there listening to this who might be in that kind of environment, and you anticipate a lot of stuff coming at you during your day. You can actually pre-visualize what's going to happen for you that day. So same thing, awareness. Imagine a heated conversation that you expect is coming up. Actually put yourself in that moment in the awareness stage. Be in the physical sensations that you think might come up. Practice shifting out of those rage sensations to calm or ground or curiosity, whatever it might be. Anchor in something else, and then visualize yourself taking an action that's actually helpful in that.
Okay. So one of my defaults, if I go to when my wife and I have conflict and I feel very angry, my default is to detach. It's like system shutdown. So what you're saying is really put myself back in a situation like that. And I know that the path most traveled, and when I say most, almost always, is the system shutdown and detachment. Is I need to see or re-anchor that in a different experience, a different feeling to help inform the new pathway, the new muscle that needs to be developed.
So I'd say, first of all, great awareness with you, right? Because system shutdown and detachment, it's one of those things, it's one of those areas of lower emotional intelligence that's harder to spot because you're not throwing things around, right? It's fine. I don't have a problem with emotions. I just close them off and walk away. There's no problem here.
Because I don't have them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so for you, what you might notice as you visualize yourself, as you feel back in to those moments, what you might notice is physiological sensations of pulling away, of withdrawing, of even turning away. I know because I've had this, where you might just see yourself, your energy pulling back and turning away. Those might be some of the physiological sensations that you notice. And so you might anchor in facing in. You might anchor in, I'm not going to turn away. I'm going to face in. And so just even notice, what do you need to do in your body? What do you have to shift to be able to face in rather than turn away?
I don't know what it is, but even thinking about that, like I've got a highly developed strategy here that has been successful in whatever ways. But even thinking about turning and facing it creates a level of anxiety. And I'm not even in conflict right now.
You're so courageous. I appreciate you so much for sharing this. I get it. I've been there. I get it. I get it. And that's just a sign it's your growth edge. And what I would say is practicing, if we can't even do it in our imaginations or visualizations, it's very, very hard to
Yeah,
do it.
we won't be able to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the practice.
And it comes down to I think a driver of any type of human change. And that's what's important to me about changing this. Okay. I'm going to commit to you. I'm going to start practicing
I
this,
love
and
it. I love it, Jason. Yeah.
you can message my wife and see the
Okay.
impact.
She's a lucky woman. She's a lucky woman. She's gonna get changed. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, true or false? We're going to jump into a true or false section. I've got a few true or false that I want to throw at you. No sitting on the fence. Make a call and then back it up with a story, experience, or rationale. Some of these we may have touched on a little bit already, but here's the first true or false. Having high EQ means you do not get upset.
False. You have feelings of upset when you have a range of emotions when you have high EQ. That's what we want. So there's a lot of research out there. People with a higher range of emotions, higher emo diversity is called, are actually happier in life.
EMO, say that.
Emo diversity. People with a higher range of emotions, higher emo diversity, are happier in life.
So the more emotions I feel,
Yeah.
both positive or
Yeah.
negative, means I
Right?
live a happier life.
We're actually happier. Yeah. So feeling the emotions is not the problem. Feeling the upset, not the problem. How we work through it, how we communicate it to others, that might be growth areas, but having those experiences are,
It's what being
yeah,
human is all about. Well, and if we think of the evolutionary role that emotions have played,
yeah,
there's a very important part that they play in our success.
yeah,
They're indicators, they're feedback mechanisms,
yeah,
they're giving us important information.
yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes, when we think of evolution, really our bodies just care about us staying physically safe so we can pass on our genes and procreate, which is maybe not our leadership and professional goals. And so that's part of the reason, exactly what you said, why we want to pay attention to what's happening in our emotional world, because our emotional world really is prioritizing this physical safety piece and us passing on our genes. And so we want to get curious and learn to work skillfully with our emotions so that we can lead ourselves towards the leadership and life goals that we have. We have.
Yeah. When it comes to this whole concept of EQ doesn't mean that you're eliminating emotions. It's more of emotional agency where
Yeah.
I get to choose
Yes.
how I navigate this when these emotions show
I
up.
love that. Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
Okay, true or false? Most rational, objective decisions are made when individuals successfully suppress their emotions to rely on logic.
I would say false. I would say false. I think maybe there's no emotions involved in the decision you're making. Maybe there is. If there is, pay attention to what the emotions are saying. Get the data. Doesn't mean you listen entirely to what the emotions are saying. Just get the data. Get the data, get the information, use your cognitive intelligence, that cognitive data as well, and then make the decision. I think you'll find a more informed decision that way.
Well, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio would agree with you because he says that emotions are structural prerequisites for rational decision making. That oftentimes in studies where there are patients that have damage to their emotional centers, despite having perfectly intact logic, will become paralyzed decision makers
Wow, interesting.
because you don't understand the cost or the trade off.
Yeah, fascinating.
So you can get overwhelmed by just the logic perspective.
Fascinating.
Okay, here's a true or false. Women possess an innate biological advantage in emotional intelligence compared to men.
I don't think that's true. I think culturally we've been conditioned in different ways. And I'm all about, elevating women to leadership positions. And I think that there are things that have happened in the male gender that have been conditioned in that need to be repatterned there as well. Right. And I have to say, actually, some of my coaching clients that I love the most are men who are connecting in with their emotionality and their empathy and wanting to lead and empathetic and compassionate. And they have this. It's not that they don't have it. It's there. Uh, it's just that it hasn't always been culturally acceptable for them to share it. And I think our world will change when they can.
Let's jump to the next section. Would you rather? I believe leadership is just a giant game of would you rather, trade-offs, tensions. Rarely are there perfect options. And so it's making these difficult choices. I've got a few would you rathers, just like the true or false. Your job is to prove which one you'd rather. And one that came up here is, and I'm making this up on the spot based on an earlier discussion we had. Would you rather be a leader who's perfectly composed and doesn't upset people? Or would you rather be great at cleaning up relationships when things go wrong?
I'd rather be the second one. I mean, I'll share that that's more in line with who I am. I am an emotional person. I know this about myself. And I feel alive. I feel alive, So I do have, when I read that research that people with a greater emotional range or have more happiness, I was like, yes, finally, it's a victory for me here.
Yeah.
I feel like that's true. Well, I do. I have joy, I have frustration, I have anger, I have happiness, and that can be within a 1 hour span. Yeah, I'd rather have the aliveness and the messiness. I'd rather have the aliveness and the messiness than the perfection.
Well, isn't that what art does? Whether it's performing arts or when we see something that makes us pause, whether I'm watching Les Mis and just feel the pain, or if I'm inspired by something, that ride of emotions is what makes us feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Creates memories and makes life worth living, I think.
Yeah, and create stories. A slightly different one. Would you rather strictly regulate your emotions to stay calm,
Mm.
reliable, and risk appearing cold and inauthentic? Or lead with emotional transparency that builds trust but destabilizes your team in a crisis?
That's a tricky one. Again, my default is definitely towards the latter, and I see the value in the former. I see the stability as being really important. Such a hard trade-off. Yeah, the second one comes more naturally to me, and I see the value in the first one. So I would pick the second, and I really see the value in the first one.
One of the things that we see so many 360 peer reviews, and one of the things that stands out to me with many of the strong leaders is when people acknowledge the calmness that they possess in a crisis. And it almost to the point that it frustrates people. How certain leaders can be calm in a crisis, almost the stoic or cold, but it's something that people tend to really value as that thing, that leader they can tether to during uncertainty.
Yeah. I've heard this analogy of it's a parenting coach that I interviewed once for a podcast that I used to have. And she talked about this analogy of a plane. If you hit turbulence, you do not want the pilot to come out and be like, what should we do here? I don't know what to do. Somebody help me out, right? You want the pilot to stay there, calm and confident, flying the plane. And so that's the analogy that comes up for me, right? Is how important that is, particularly in a crisis, for that calm, I know what I'm doing, we're going this way presence in those moments.
Liz, what's the worst advice someone could get if they're on the path they want to develop their EQ?
I'm drawn to saying, don't worry about the emotional wheel, because I see that a lot where people are like, here's the wheel, pick your emotion on here. I think it's great. It does help. It helps move us away from sad, mad, bad, glad to like a host of like 80 or 90 other emotions we can have as an adult. But my guidance would be to less worry about the word you give, the experience you're having, and more pay attention to what's happening at the level of sensations where emotions actually take place.
Okay, so tell me more about don't worry about the wheel.
Yeah. So in several emotional intelligence trainings I've done, the wheel has been the tool that you walk away with and, look at the wheel and pick your emotion on here. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying we can label our emotions incorrectly. Almost like that woman who said, I'm overwhelmed when actually she was angry. And so when we can pay attention to what are the physical sensations that I'm experiencing, which is where emotions happen, it's in the body, then we actually improve our emotional skillfulness more quickly.
So don't worry about the word that other people might give to it. It's the process is you giving it a word and unpacking it.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the process is paying attention to what's actually happening below your neck, It's where emotions happen. They don't happen in our ear, or our elbow. They happen generally somewhere in your core area. Pay attention to what's happening there.
We dove into a lot in this discussion. If a listener only remembered one thing about EQ and their journey in EQ, what should it be?
I want to say that if you are spending a good amount of your day, even a good amount, but an amount you're not happy with, leaning into what we talked about as those like addictive tendencies,
Distraction,
the
the diverge,
distractions, the doom scrolling, sometimes the impulsive shopping or the overworking or the mindless eating. And you're doing it in a way that really you're just not happy with, right? I'm not talking about 15, but it's a couple hours. It's even more than that. It's happening every day. And that's really eroding your well-being, your effectiveness. I would say use that as a clue that you have some growth to do in emotional intelligence and that you can do it. This is a skill that can be learned. That's what I would say.
it's putting in the quality reps like anything else. So, listeners, if you've made it this far, then you know your job. It's to find something that you really connected with in this episode and then put it to work. That's what being in the laboratory is. Liz, thank you for diving into EQ, the ARC method, and everything. And I appreciate you being on the Executive Commute.
Thank you, Jason. It was a delight to speak with you. Thanks for having me.
We'll get you on again.